So there are lots of games where I craft, but there are much fewer games where I actually look forward to what's going to happen when I craft. Crafting is one of the most common RPG systems. You find it in farming sims, survivals, MMOs, cozy games, creature collectors, and fantasy RPGs. But a lot of the time, crafting can often feel less like you're actually making something and more like you're just paying some kind of tax. I'm not making an iron sword. I'm trading in my wood and my iron ore that I spent an hour collecting and getting the item I actually want. It's more like a trade, if anything, and maybe a cost for time. Now, I'm not saying every crafting system needs to be deep, but I am saying that if it's going to cost the player time, resources, possibly even money, then it definitely needs to earn its place in the game. So your typical loop looks something like collect ingredients, unlock the recipe, open the menu, click craft, and receive your item. Of course, this isn't automatically bad. A lot of times crafting is used for utility or for progression, quests, achievements, survival, or even build optimization. And those are all valid gameplay reasons to have this kind of crafting. But the issue is when crafting becomes something that players continually interact with. So in a lot of cases, crafting becomes something that you do to get from A to B, and there's no emotional attachment or any kind of emotional interaction. I don't want to sacrifice 3 mushrooms to the UI god and then receive potion number 47. I want my weird little bog witch to do something questionable and possibly useful. So in these cases, I really feel like crafting should know what it's doing. It should know what its role is and what role it's supporting in the fantasy game. And sometimes that means utility. Sometimes that means potions, arrows, food, Pokeballs, healing items, and basic tools. And when that's the case, that kind of crafting should really be clear, intuitive, and painless to do. Any kind of tedium associated with that kind of crafting gets really old really fast. Some examples of games that use these crafting systems really well would probably be Pokémon and The Witcher 3. In Pokémon, you're not making things because you're an artisan. You're making things because you need the right tools. In The Witcher, there's a whole preparation process associated with crafting in that game. It gives it a special role that supports your battles. That type of crafting might lack emotional attachment, but it's such a useful and painless process that it still is an enjoyable part of the game. There's also progression crafting, where crafting gates new areas or new levels of power. Stardew Valley does this really well. It starts out practical when you're crafting, and then over time, it actually defines the identity of your farm by what you've unlocked and what you've decided to add. And then there's one of my favorite types of crafting, which is experimental or expressive crafting. This kind of crafting is where crafting plays a part in play, personality, and risks, as well as discovery. So my favorite example for this type of crafting is actually Morrowind, and that's because Morrowind has a spell-making system as a part of its crafting system that allows you to kind of mix and match and make your own custom spells that are really only limited by what you can actually pay for. Can you pay for the power level of the spell? And if you can, there's really no limit. You can end up having gameplay campaigns that are really memorable and fun because you were able to make something silly or discover a funny way that 2 spells combine or something. They can have both good and bad properties, and it just depends on the skill of the expert, how much they're using, what they're actually using, and what equipment they're using to make it, so that they can pull out different isolated properties of different ingredients. And there's also an element of instability in there that of which the margin grows smaller as they obtain more skills in the field. But there's always an element of I don't always know for sure what I'm gonna get, but I have a reasonable guess. And you can also save your signature creations that you make in the game so that if you ever want to recreate it to the best of your ability, you'll be able to do that pretty easily. So I find that kind of crafting, if you can include it and if it makes sense for the genre that you're working with. It allows certain attachments to items and making things that doesn't really exist otherwise. It allows customization. If you have a persistent world, it allows legendary or legacy aspects to your items, where in the case of Celestial Fall, for example, maybe your first character makes a sword that is very sentimental and specific to your character and everything that they went through throughout their life. And then they die and then leave their sword behind to their son or their friend or a family member. And then you make another character and you run into the same sword on a different character. And so it's just little organic, enjoyable, personalized experiences that are allowed because you're able to do something experimental or super custom. I think a lot of what can make a crafting system design feel flat is usually a lack of meaning or a lack of significance. So the person who made it doesn't matter, the location doesn't matter, what they used didn't matter, the process doesn't matter, the ingredients are generic, and the result is identical to every copy. So what ends up happening in these flatter systems is that crafting becomes more of a transaction, and the end result typically ends up being something like Dragon Age, where yes, you can make custom things, maybe, but you're always in the end going to want the named gear, the quest gear, because that's always the better gear. Or you need it for companions, or there's story context. There's sentimentality or meaningfulness or emotional attachment related to the narrative of the game even, rather than from the act of crafting itself. And that's, again, not really a failure or anything. It's just a nature of the system that when you're including crafting in your game, it's naturally going to have to compete with other sources of meaning. So it can be really fun when you can kind of include an extra dose of meaning in that system. So there are a lot of different ways that fun can look in a crafting system. For example, maybe your crafting system isn't super complex, but it's very punchy, it's very quick, and it's satisfying, and it's useful. So the Stardew Valley machines that you make are really fun because they fit in the daily loop of the chores and stuff that you're doing throughout the day. Everything you do is making your life a little bit easier and allowing a little bit more of other aspects of the game to be enjoyed. The preparation type craft also has its own flavor, because the satisfaction that comes out of that isn't out of the crafting itself, it's that you made the right thing before the danger happened and it actually helped you succeed. With custom crafting or experimental crafting, the most fun part of that, obviously, is when you combine things and you get weird results. There's also more expressive crafting, where items you make change depending on, say, the alignment of your character, or they include very personal aspects of a character's personality. They have trinkets. They're customized to the point that they're so unique that it wouldn't make sense for any other character to wield it. And that's something you might see more often maybe in MMOs. So a grindy type of crafting system can still be really good if the loop is fast, readable, rewarding, and tied to meaningful goals. Grind only becomes tedious when it becomes slow, unclear, repetitive, and disconnected. That's probably the worst part. If it's disconnected from anything the player actually cares about, that is the worst kind of grind. Please don't give me a game that lets me make choices and then I find out that the choices don't matter. I'm looking at Far Cry 4. So in Celestial Fall, crafting isn't just about obtaining items, it's about supporting roles that characters can actually play. So a chef shouldn't feel like a potion vendor with different icons. An alchemist shouldn't feel like they're just printing buffs. A smith isn't just a sword machine. Because the fantasy isn't, I made a potion. Fantasy is, I understand the world well enough to experiment with it. And when you're an artisan, a lot of times you're making things for people you actually know. You're making things for your family, you're making things for your friends and your local vendors, people that you are with and talking to every day. There's an emotional aspect to your crafting already, just from the relationships of the people that you're making them for. And maybe you're not always making them for people you know, maybe you're making them for a traveler, or maybe you're making them for, somebody who's transient and just stopping through. But then comes the part where You want people to know you make something really good, or you want to show off your creativity and your skills so that you're not just talked about as the smith in this town, but also the town 2 nodes over. And after you're gone, those swords that you made are still going to be here. They're still going to be circulating. They're not going to just go away unless they get totally left in disrepair and somebody, like, I don't know, throws it in a pool of lava or something. Or I guess if you had a really nasty enemy that went out of their way to dismantle every sword that you've ever made, that would be pretty messed up. But the point is that items have persistence in Celestial Fall. They have emotional attachment. The system is going to support that role. So that's why chefs and alchemists get a custom experimental menu. And that's why people who make buildings and clothing and swords and tools and these sorts of things also get a certain level of customization too. When you make a dress, for example, as a tailor, you're not just making some generic dress, you're making your version of that dress, and you're contributing to the culture of your location. You're contributing to what is displayed in social status. You're helping define regional style and personality and identity. So the crafting system really needs to understand what kind of role the player is trying to play through their character. So this way you can have those swords passed down in your family, or a cooking pot that gets passed from one mom to the next, or a wedding ring, for example, that gets made from ore that was obtained on a super dangerous trip, or maybe a weird potion that got created which became a local dare. Because Celestial Fall is persistent across characters and generation, items can outlive the people that made them. And not all of them are going to be legendary, but maybe they'll just be locally meaningful. So that said, if crafting is frequent, it needs to respect the player's time. Depth doesn't have to mean a bad UI. Use contextual lists. Show relevant recipes, use tags, icons, filters, and requirements, and then save the exhaustive information if you want to make that available to your player with in-game guides and encyclopedias. That way, you can still have friction in your game around a grindy system like crafting, because it creates a decision, a risk, or a feeling. If the friction only creates more clicks, it's probably a bad UI. So crafting doesn't have to be huge, it doesn't have to be complicated, or even realistic. It doesn't have to let every player become some legendary inventor, but it should know why it exists. Maybe it supports survival, maybe it allows progression, maybe it lets players experiment and express themselves, or even leave something behind. But if crafting is going to take up hours of someone's time, it should give them something back, whether that's a useful tool, a funny discovery, or a personal item, or even just a better story. At the very least, it needs to be a process that feels good to use. So that's the design problem that I'm thinking about this week with Celestial Fall. I'd love to hear how you've seen this handled in other games. What worked, what annoyed you, and what do you wish more RPGs would try? And if you want to follow Celestial Fall more closely, I'll leave links down below in the description.